I'm old enough to remember where I was the day that President Kennedy was shot. I was a third grader at St. Rita's School here in Louisville, and it was the early afternoon. I remember the principal coming over the loudspeaker and telling us that something had happened to the president. I don't think we knew that he had been killed, at least at that moment. And then she asked us all to begin to pray. And so our instructor, our teacher, told us to get out of our desks, to kneel on the floor. And I remember that we prayed the rosary. At some point, an announcement came through that the president had been killed. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a grown-up cry, my third grade teacher. I remember that the day that President Kennedy was shot. Now, I remember other vintage days. I remember the day that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. I remember the Challenger explosion. In fact, almost etched in my mind as I'm talking to you is the 3 entrails of smoke coming from that from the Challenger as it began to crash right in front of our very eyes. And I've never forgotten that image. And that means, of course, 9/11, just like you, is really burned into my memory. I remember it greatly, the staggering nature of it, the shocking nature of it. And if you recall, on the day of 9/11, there was so little we knew about it. We knew that something had happened. The TV was on all day. In fact, they never even broke away for commercial for a series of days after that. But the reality was that the news just kept being the same thing. We really didn't know what had happened. It was just a huge mystery. What, who, where, why? Was there going to be more? We always have to kind of remember that. We see the buildings burning, but we don't remember there was just so much more associated with what was happening that day, and so little that we know. And it is this ability to recover a past memory that also triggers our spiritual life. And so I want to look at the 2 scriptures this morning, the first reading and the gospel. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah. One thing that we learn about, particularly this book, the book of the prophet Isaiah, there's not just a man named Isaiah. It's mentioned at the very beginning of it. The first set of prophecies, in fact, the scholars believe there's about 4 different Isaiahs in Isaiah. Probably none of them with the name Isaiah, I might add. And this spans over 3 centuries of time. The early 8 centuries before the birth of Christ. The part that we heard this morning is almost certainly written during the time of the Babylonian exile, which was 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. So Isaiah takes centuries to emerge out of writings, and scholars will combine all them into an Old Testament book that we see now. But it was a work in progress while it was happening. Jesus, intimately aware of Isaiah, so often uses it, and of course he inspired its writing, so he knows everything about it. The Isaiah reading this morning deals with someone who is suffering, a servant who is suffering. And it mentions those biblical concepts of suffering that we don't like to hear, that, you know, that people are going to pluck our beard, that they're going to slap our cheek, that they're going to do something, and then in this prophecy, we're to do nothing in response to that. You know how that's difficult for us to do, but right there is in Isaiah's prophecy. Jesus now picks up this in his life because he is the suffering servant that the prophets are very obliquely pointing to when they're writing their prophecy. And so Jesus, now we get him appearing with his apostles, and his famous question to Peter at Caesarea Philippi, "Who do you say that I am?" Now he starts off asking who everyone else says he is, everything has it wrong. So we get to where someone at least has it right. He says to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Son of, you're the Christ of God." There's different ways it's translated, but he's basically confessing who Jesus is, the way we say it in the creed that we'll do just in a few minutes. Missing from the Mark version we hear, but present in either Matthew or Luke, I can't remember which, when Jesus says this very same thing, then Jesus says in reply, after he says, "You are the Christ," he says to Peter, "Mere mortals have not revealed this to you, but God the Father himself." I think that's an important addition missing from Mark, that he is praising Peter for being a spokesperson for God, because he is much like the prophet Isaiah, saying something of great prophetic significance. Now, you got to love Peter, because he can in one moment be a spokesman for God and turn it all around in the next moment. He's a master at that. And so when Jesus begins to reveal to them the true nature of his work, the true nature of his journey, the Paschal mystery. We know that he's going to journey to the cross. We know that already. We know what is going to happen. The disciples did not know. And here we hear the first time Jesus clearly and plainly speaks to them about what is to happen. Peter, who just before had been inspired by God, suddenly rebukes Jesus. That should be an indicator he's on thin ice. He rebukes Jesus, and then again in a different version of this gospel, Matthew or Luke, can't remember which one, doesn't matter which one, Peter then says that God forbid something like this happen to you. And that's when Jesus then turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are speaking as human beings do rather than the way God speaks." That phrase, "get behind me, Satan," is clearly a rebuke. Peter has become, unwittingly it seems, a spokesman for Satan. He's literally using his words. God forbid something like this happen to you. You see, Jesus' sacrifice on Calvary is absolutely, positively, unequivocally necessary. There is no question about that. Any delay from this event will undo the salvation that is to await the world. Therefore, it cannot be undone. It's an evil beyond imagination. It's, in fact, Satan's great orchestration of evil. His recognition of the danger of Jesus. Remember, he tempted him in the desert. We first learn this, "Get behind me, Satan," from Jesus himself. The Gospels that we read on the first Sunday of Lent, the temptations in the desert. Jesus and the devil alone. They're the only two people that are there. And the devil tempts Jesus on the second of the three temptations. He takes him up a high mountain. He says, "I will give you all the countries of the world if you'll simply kneel before you." And you might remember, God rebukes him that we do nothing except for God alone. The reality of that promise Satan made to Jesus during the temptation was that those weren't his countries. They weren't his to get. You see, Satan is the great deceiver. Everything that he says is false. Everything is about his agenda to usurp God's authority, something that is impossible to take place. And so everything must be viewed through this lens. That kind of temptation of Jesus in the desert, Satan, who's audacious enough to tempt God, certainly has no problem tempting you or me. In fact, we are infinitely easier. Jesus, in that moment, though, recognizes Satan, as he does often, particularly in Mark's gospel, when people are possessed, those different things where he sees him and rebukes the demons. Remember, the demons are the legion of Satan. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." You see, it's that recognition that whatever Satan is offering, whatever Satan is saying we should do, is the exact opposite of what we need to do. We don't want to become an unwitting, or even worse, a witting spokesman for Satan. You know, the 9/11 incident, when it happened, helped us. We began to also study how we process trauma on such a mega international stage, on a national stage, and on our personal lives. And so many of us became more aware of the study of the stages of grief, particularly when we were trying to make some attempt to grasp at what was going on and to get some healing after the 9/11 incident. The stages of grief are very famously, and remember, these are not in any particular sequence, although I'm going to give them to you in the most commonly rendered sequence. The first stage, usually of a traumatic event, is denial. I can't believe what I just saw. Many of us did that without even thinking about it, without even understanding as we're looking on our TV screens, or perhaps someone told you, "Did you just hear a plane hit a tower in New York?" There are different ways that we hear it, and so often we say, "That didn't happen." We do it often when there's trauma. The first thing we do to protect ourselves is to say, "This isn't true, this isn't really happening." Sometimes the only way you and I can survive intense personal trauma is to deny it in the beginning until we're able to marshal a much better response. The second stage, which doesn't always necessarily immediately follow, but sometimes it does, is the stage of anger. In anger, we begin to lash out at whatever has happened to us traumatically. This is what we learn about brain science, is that when we lash out in anger, we are using the most reptilian and mammalian part of our brain, and I might add the least rational part of our brain. Something about the prefrontal cortex and something in the back, and that's as much as we need to say this morning, other than to say that when we're angry, we are not using our rational mind. That would be why, for example, yours truly, when he's driving in traffic and someone does something that I find offensive, I'd start a trail of expletives that would make me embarrassed if you heard me speak that way, as if somehow getting angry, shouting, screaming, or whatever at the car was going to make all the events stop. Of course, it doesn't. But it's hair trigger. I really have tried to work on it. I do it less, like instead of every million times, I do it 1 minus every million times, but at least something I'm working on. But the hair trigger nature of it happens so quickly. The reaction comes so quickly. And so we recognize that anger is the least rational part of our response to something, and it can happen quickly and have usually rather explosive effects when we do it. The third stage of grieving is called bargaining, and that's where we begin to negotiate away whatever the trauma is that's coming. As a nation, we began to bargain as we started bargaining away every one of our freedoms. You might remember before 9/11, it wasn't that big of an effort to get on a plane. Now an Olympian athlete can't get through everything that we have to get through to do that. All of that was necessary, but how willingly we were able to bargain away. The surveillance that has happened in our country was in large part a response in anger and fear to the events of 9/11, and without even giving it a question, we just simply surrendered away freedom to people who haven't given it back to us, if you haven't checked lately. In the bargaining process, if I do this, if I do that, I will be safe. I remember the night of 9/11 because the Holy Spirit, we had a major funeral that morning, and my job, once we knew something had happened, was to monitor the events on the television and let the pastor know what was going on after the funeral. And the gravity of it became rather real to us. Sometime in the middle of the day, we knew that we needed to do, it started off a prayer service in the evening. And you know, when Catholics try to do a prayer service, it's always a mess. I mean, what would you do? What would you say? The easiest thing for us to do is celebrate Mass. It requires no creativity. And so we made the decision to actually celebrate Mass. Father Tom said he was completely gassed by the funeral. He asked if I would do it and preach it. And you know me, I'm not going to turn down an opportunity to preach, although I had no idea what I was going to say. The thing that made me feel better about the stress of it was that it was the middle of the afternoon. There was no way we could make an announcement. This is before cell phones, at least for most of us. And so no one would even know we were having church. Well, we had Mass at 7 o'clock, and the church was completely full. There wasn't room for another human being. And I have to always remind myself of that. I looked to a mostly empty church this morning that it's not that people don't know we're having Mass. They know where to go when they feel the need to connect spiritually. And so it's a good reminder of that. On that evening, people who'd never seen before were simply there as we celebrated Eucharist together. I remember preaching to them our temptation to anger that would be perfectly understandable. We wanted to go blow something up, but what? We wanted to attack a country. Who? We wanted to find a villain. The ones that were the true villains had been killed in the plane crash. I mean, what were we going to do? You see that whole sense that we were doing. And I indicated that what we were doing there in the evening, praying, was the most effective thing we could do. Although that praying is, for many of us, the least satisfying, when we'd much rather indulge our reflex for anger, that part that comes from our reptilian brain. So I remember that particularly from 9/11, and I think that we can move out of 9/11 and go into the more ordinary, but sometimes also very traumatic drama of our daily lives. Often we are tempted to anger. I hear confessions, every one of you say it. I say it myself when I go to confession. We're often tempted to anger. We can say sharp words on a minute's notice. We can say things that hurt people's reputation, become judgmental about people. Every one of us, no matter what color your skin is, whatever, engages in bigotry. We do it, and then we say we didn't do it, but people don't understand what we're doing. There's a lot of ways that you and I react to things that happen in our environment that upon greater reflection, when we examine our conscience, which we should do, we recognize as sinful. What we don't recognize is in those moments when our reptilian brain is in charge, rather than our prefrontal cortex, which teaches us the things of spirituality, the things of our faith. When we engage our reptilian and mammalian brain, what we don't recognize is we become an unwitting spokesman for Satan. It's always missing. I do it myself. You know, when somebody is leaves a bass cart. That's a mortal sin to me, the bass cart in the parking lot at Kroger. I think I may be the only one really so upset about it. I cannot control how mad I get when I see it. Or just any of the things that happen, particularly in a grocery store. The line's moving too slowly. Someone's in the middle of the aisle and not moving quick enough. Or perhaps I'm not moving quick enough and someone's irritated with me. All of it can make me irritated in a heartbeat. And it doesn't occur to me then, even though I'm preaching it to you now, that in that moment, Satan is instigating something with me. I'm his unwitting accomplice when I lash out at what is clearly an unwitting person. They almost never know they're taking too much time in the line. They almost never know that they put the bass cart here. They've gone and done this because they got distracted. It's just simply not the way that they're engaging the world, and that we engage them, and you don't realize the real engagement needs to be with Satan. What we have to learn to do, and what I'm still trying to learn to do myself, is to recognize that we're tempted far more often than we realize that we are. And that when we recognize that we're tempted, respond differently. You see, when we can tell ourselves, I'm being tempted, it's not easy, but you can tell yourself, if you really work on your emotions, you can tell that you're about to erupt. You can tell that you're going to escalate. There are ways to be able to discern that. You can then be able to tell yourself, this is Satan. Whatever he's tempting me to do, I'm certain this will not work out well for me. And then the only thing that we can say to him is, get behind me, Satan. You know, the reason it doesn't seem very effective, I agree, lashing out at the lady in the aisle seems more effective. I mean, I'm mad, she's there, maybe she moves, whatever. That's really what I want in the first place. But the reality is that lashing out doesn't resolve the issue. And the idea that we're going to say, get behind me, Satan, doesn't sound very satisfying, does it? Because maybe the lady still won't move out of her way in the aisle, which is what we really want. So we might even tell ourselves, to tell Satan to get behind me is wasted words, because he's not going to do it. And you're right about that. He is not going to do it. You see, you can't make Satan stop tempting you. I don't know how many times I have to remind myself of that. No matter how holy you try to be, no matter how much theology you try to read, no matter how well you examine your conscience and celebrate your sacraments, and I encourage all of that, it has zero control over the tempter, who will continue to control because he's opportunistic. He knows at some point our weak human flesh will give in. At some point our reptilian brain will emerge. So saying, get behind me, Satan, simply reminds us what's really happening. And when we can be reminded that, we're less likely to fall into sin. When we fall into sin, we know what we must do, which is either confess or our more venial types of sins. These are a way of recognizing our sinfulness and receiving God's grace. You see, the next stages of grief are depression, and unfortunately too many people set there, which means this all is overwhelming, it's big, nothing can be done about it. Every one of us goes through versions of that. You can't avoid that. It's part of a response to trauma, but it's not the end of the road. You see, beyond that depression, which is inevitable, but hopefully short-lived, but beyond that is something called acceptance. Acceptance simply accepts that the past event cannot be altered. It doesn't excuse the past event. It doesn't forget the past event. It simply recognizes this cannot be undone. It's the only way we begin to move forward. And that last step, which has been added, called meaning, is, I think, equally important. Finding out that the suffering, while awful, has not been completely robbed of meaning. You see, that's what God does. God is able to resolve human suffering into something meaningful, which is resurrection. That's the whole point of our Christian life. There is no other point to our Christian life than to prepare ourselves to be raised from the dead and to be with God forever in heaven. There's no other agenda. That's the whole concept, the whole idea, but we have to keep that prize before us. And every time we celebrate Eucharist together, that's exactly what happens. God reminds us He's the central meaning in our life. God reminds us that He is the one in charge of the universe. God reminds us that we think like humans do because, well, we're humans. But God thinks like God does because, well, He is God. It's a good idea to practice saying, "Get behind me, Satan," when we're triggered, even though we know it won't be effective. Why is that a good idea since it isn't going to be effective? It isn't going to make him stop? Well, it was good enough for Jesus. And if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us.